Thank you. It's a real privilege and honour to be here addressing the Fagforbundet and the NTL unions, not least because I'm a trade unionist myself, a very humble, low-level local official in my own branch. So excuse me if I'm a bit intimidated in speaking to such a large and important trade union organisation. But I think the issues that I want to talk about actually are issues that we don't talk about enough in my union, and I think in the trade union movement generally. We talk about the issues, but maybe not, I think, in the way that cuts to the real heart of the issue. And in the book that I was very kindly introduced, that was referenced in that very kind introduction, The Corporate Criminal, the point that's made in the book is that corporations kill more, maim more people, they steal from more people, and they rip more people off than all other types of crime combined. And this is not just something we say lightly. This is when, even when you take into account a law which has mechanisms within it which allow corporations very often to get away with the crimes that they commit. And I'll give you one example. In the UK, the hazards movement, the rank and file trade union safety movement, has estimated that 50,000 people are killed every year as a result of either sudden injury or occupational illness and disease. The official estimates are much smaller. This estimate has been supported by academic research. Even if you look at the injuries that are caused by sudden injuries, the deaths that are caused by sudden injury in the UK, probably something between 1,500 and 2,000 deaths without any contestation. So, and that's many more times than we find, for example, in street murders and so on, right? So once you begin to unpick those figures, and I haven't even begun to discuss the financial sector, it becomes very easy to defend the proposition that corporations kill more people, maim more people, steal from more people than we find in the case of street criminals. And if we think on a global scale, actually, the ILO estimates about 2.5 million people a year are killed as a result of working, either through injuries or illnesses. That's about 6,000 a day. If most of them result from breaches of the law, and in that book we argue in detail how we can clearly see how breaches of the law result in many, if not the majority of those deaths, then we have a crime problem, and we have a crime problem that we don't talk about very often. And I think actually most people in this room probably kind of are not surprised by that argument and by what I'm saying. What I want to talk about is that, or what I want to talk about and focus on today, is our response, how we respond to that. And our response in the trade union movement, and as critical academics generally, has to be to say, well, there isn't enough regulation, there isn't enough enforcement, and we know that also if I had more time, I'd talk about the decline, the general decline in regulatory enforcement that we found particularly in the last 30 years, the so-called neoliberal period, particularly across developed economies. What should our response be to this huge scale of corporate crime? What should our response be to the attacks on enforcement? Generally, because we're in a defensive position, our response is more regulation, more enforcement, more prosecution. And in a way, we have to argue that, because one thing that we know is that if you're in an employer that is systematically breaking the law, then regulatory intervention, particularly prosecution, will focus minds, and in some cases will strengthen workers. So we have to argue that. We also, I think, and I don't think, it sounds contradictory, I'm not sure it is a contradiction, at the same time we have to recognise that that's not necessarily our solution in the long term, and that's really the point that I'll get to in this discussion. So, can I just take some water? I'm trying out here. before we get to that point, I want to say that it's quite important to recognize as a starting point that, okay, if we're talking about more enforcement, more regulation, there is a decline in enforcement, not just in terms of health and safety at work. I would argue in most European countries across most fields of corporate regulation, whether that's the environment, food safety, and so on, or the search for alternative forms of regulation which don't necessarily involve enforcement, don't necessarily involve the full force of the law. So if we argue for more, then we are kind of locating ourselves in a fundamental antagonism. And I think, of course, we're trade unionists, people here are trade unionists, you know about antagonisms. There is a fundamental antagonism. It doesn't always come to the surface, but a fundamental antagonism between employees and employers. There's a fundamental antagonism between the interests of private investors and the interests of workers. I know most people here are in the public sector, but in the private sector that's very, very clear. But the antagonism that that is talked about, particularly in academic studies and generally in the way we think about regulation, is an antagonism between the state and the market, an antagonism between the public and the private sector at that kind of level. In other words, there's a fundamental antagonism between governments and corporations, and that's really been the assumption that's underpinned our discussions of globalization over the last 30 years or so. And very many academics are guilty of making a very simple zero-sum conclusion that as the power of markets and corporations has risen over the last 30 to 40 years, that means that the power of states has declined. I think that's grossly oversimplifying, and I think we have to say at the starting point, actually, there's a much more mutually reinforcing relationship between states and capital that we need to start with. And this is really, I mean, I started off talking about health and safety regulation. If we look at the birth of health and safety regulation in Europe, and very often it's the UK Factories Acts, I don't think it's necessarily the case, but very often the UK Factories Acts are seen as being the kind of starting point where workers' agitation led to the regulation of the workplace. So starting around the 1830s, a series of acts which were introduced to regulate the age of factory workers, the hours that they could work, and so on. Now, the reason those acts were introduced was simply because capital was out of control. There was, as Karl Marx said in Capital, he has a very, very, you don't have to be a Marxist to appreciate his really detailed analysis of this history at the time, a slow sacrifice of humanity, he argued. That in places like Stoke, which was where the big pottery factories were in the north of England, the average life expectancy of a factory worker was 19. And the consequence of that was that the workers in the local area were dying more quickly than they could be replaced, than they could grow up and work in the pottery factories. So the slow sacrifice of humanity was not a concern necessarily. I mean, it was partly a concern by all of the kind of charitable trusts and some politicians on humanitarian basis, but it was a concern also for capital and for capitalism because it was exhausting the supply of the labor force. So regulation, its very basis, was there to ensure that the system continued and could reproduce itself, that the factory system could continue and reproduce itself. The consequence, and this was another key point made by Marx in Capital, the consequence was that it led to a regeneration, and it led to an economic spurring on of the factory system. Because once there were regulations in place to protect workers, it meant the factory owners had to invest in machinery. They had to maintain production. They had to invest their capital in machinery. So what happened, and this is very typical. I mean, this story has been told again and again and again in terms of studies of regulation, that when you impose regulation, it actually very often boosts an industry or boosts economic output, boosts productivity. So we're beginning to see a slightly different picture of regulation. If that's what the effect of regulation is, then, not just to be oversimplistic and say it's good for industry or it's good for capitalism, there are some common interests here. And at one level, just as capital needs state regulation to reproduce itself, well, so does the state need capital to reproduce the capitalist system. And we don't have time to go into the long history of the corporation, but actually the history of the organization that we now know as the private profit-making corporation pretty much has its roots in the colonial period. I'm hesitating because actually the historical evidence of the first share certificate was not many people know this, but historians would claim that the first corporation was in Sweden, a company called Stora Kopparberg, because that's the longest surviving share certificate. But nonetheless, so there were rudimentary forms of joint stock, share-held corporations in Europe from probably the 13th century. But they become important in the colonial period because the state has to organize wealth and organize investment for the colonial project. And generally, that's been the pattern in capitalism. The state needs to organize investment and provide incentives to investors in order to reproduce capitalism. We're going to come back to that point in more detail later. So there's no simple antagonistic relationship between the public and the private. In fact, increasingly, particularly in this neoliberal period, we're told that the private interest is the public interest. That if the private sector grows, that's in everyone's interest, right? And I don't mean just the kind of crude discussions of the trickle-down effect that we see in some of the more right-wing politicians, which of course is economically difficult to defend. But generally we have a kind of assumption that if we help the private sector, that's good for everyone. So, and I want to say this as a kind of closing statement to this section. We need to think of regulation not necessarily in antagonistic terms, but as a state function which is able to maintain and regulate in the true sense of the word, like you would regulate a machine, you would make a machine keep on ticking over, that it maintains the machinery. Regulation maintains the machinery of commerce and of industry. And that's not to say we shouldn't argue for regulatory outcomes. We have to, because the balance of regulation is very much related to the balance of social forces. When we are weak in our workplaces, it's much more difficult to demand regulatory intervention from regulators. So it's important to argue for a better regulatory balance, but at the same time it's important to recognize the real function of regulation is to make sure the system continues uninterrupted. And I think if we just keep that in the back of our minds as I go through this discussion. So, what is neoliberalism? It's a word kind of bandied about. I'm using it to discuss the set of ideas that have been dominant in the hegemonic leadership in capitalist states in the last 30 or 40 years. By that I mean it's just the dominant ideas that we find in the elites, in ruling elites. It's not necessarily the thing that everybody believes at all times, and in fact neoliberal ideas are very difficult to sustain, as we'll see in a moment. But I want to talk about some of the myths, and I think really this is an ideology which is based on myths. The dominant set of ideas in capitalism at the moment is very easy to contest, I think, but nonetheless very powerful. So, one of the arguments is, of course, that the state is obsolete, that the state is involved in all kinds of activities that it shouldn't be involved in. And I don't know what's going on in Norway, but I'm guessing that the public sector in Norway is under pressure from the private sector all the time. And I'm guessing that, like in every other European state, that we're fighting a battle to defend state services, to defend decisions being made in public authorities, distribution of goods by the public sector rather than the private sector, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to do so. The argument is the state is not needed. Now, look, one of the things that astounds me is that claim can still be made after the 2008 financial crash. I mean, that's the crudest and the most obvious example that the state is not obsolete, particularly not for capital and for the private sector. And I'll come back to some of the details of that. One of the consequences of that argument is that we no longer need the state, and that's partly based on the idea that the private sector has developed a much more efficient way of doing things, but has developed to a level that the state could never develop. One of the consequences is we should have a bonfire of red tape. Now, I use this phrase very deliberately because the bonfire of red tape is a phrase that was used by conservative politicians in the UK, which began to take on a very chilling meaning after the Grenfell Tower fire that some of you may know about. The Grenfell Tower fire of 2017, which killed certainly more than 70 people, and which became a kind of paradigm example of neoliberal Britain, because what we had there was a countless number of contractors and subcontractors who were cutting costs on materials. We had a system of regulation in which materials were tested using desk-based surveys rather than real tests, so we never knew the flammability of the materials. We had a deregulation of housing, where the people who lived in the tower block couldn't have access to basic information about safety, and when they complained about safety, their voices weren't heard. So for a while after the Grenfell Tower disaster, we didn't hear politicians talk about the bonfire of red tape. That's come back again. Our current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, now uses the words the bonfire of red tape. And it's a phrase that is used quite cynically to denigrate the importance of regulation which protects people's lives. And it's part of the idea that we don't need the state anymore. The state is obsolete. And of course, this is based on the idea that the market is the place where you find optimum efficiency of transactions, optimum efficiency of human relations even. And so the kind of market idea of safety, of fire safety or worker safety, fire safety in homes or worker safety or whatever it might be, is that the market will sort it out. And in the context of the Grenfell Tower fire, that is very chilling, because most of the people that died in that fire were either recent migrants or were relatively low status, relatively low income people, right? And they lived in a place like that, and they had very little voice because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. They happened to live in an area called Kensington and Chelsea, which is the richest borough in the country. They live side by side, cheek by jowl, with the richest people in the country, who don't have a risk of fire safety because they can afford their homes. The idea of the market is you get what you pay for. Market efficiency, optimum efficiency of the market means exactly you get what you pay for in terms of your housing, in terms of your safety. So the market failed. The market can be optimally efficient, but it can create the risk of death by fire in that way that we saw. Based on the idea of market democracy, that actually we all have access to those, we all have access to the market, and therefore we have the ability to alter and change the market based upon our decisions, right? So market democracy replaces public democracy. And part of that market democracy is shareholder democracy, right? Because shareholders, and particularly in the UK, I think this is an issue, because the privatizations of the 80s and 90s, the big public privatizations that we went through, were based on the idea that there would be more democracy. There would be a broad base of shareholders throughout society that would replace other forms of public democracy. It's failed. It's failed. Vast majority of shares, anything between 80 and 87% of shares, depending on how you count it, are owned by big institutions. The individuals that own shares are very wealthy individuals generally. There has been no shareholder democracy in the UK, just like there is no shareholder democracy anywhere else. And partly this is based on the idea, the kind of neoliberal kind of myth of the obsolescence of the state, is that the state has given workers too much power, that the state has guaranteed too many rights for workers, and so on. That's a result of state intervention. And finally, the claim that kind of miraculously comes out of this is that the world is a safer place, largely down to the advances of business. The world is a safer place because look around you. We don't live in places where, and you know, of course, they're very Western-centric, very Eurocentric kind of analysis. We don't live in places where people are dying, where the average age, like in the Stoke potteries, of a worker is 19, or where people are having to do such dangerous and dirty work. Our economies have advanced and so on, right? Well, I mean, I'll come back to this, but one of the big questions over all of this is we are living in an economy in which increasingly our young people are questioning in relation to climate change. These advances have not guaranteed us against filling the oceans with plastic, against risking a whole series of chain reactions that are leading to global warming and climate change. They've not necessarily guaranteed us. As workers, actually, we need to know that the economy, the new economy right now, is not necessarily a safe economy. We know that we have an epidemic of stress, particularly in public sector work. In the UK, as I guess here, we are now facing a second epidemic of asbestos exposure. The first epidemic was faced by building workers. It's now being faced by an increasing number of teachers and public sector workers who are exposed to the crumbling buildings, public sector buildings that they're in. We know that many of the new technologies involve new health risks, and whether that's the construction of microchips and the exposure to heavy metals in those kind of in the construction of new technologies, or even in the new recycling industries that are supposed to be dealing with the economic crisis, the environmental crisis that we face. We have injury rates in the recycling industry in the UK now, which are at least 9 times the injury rates in other comparable industries. So, the idea that the new economy is a safer place and is a place that business is made safer is highly contestable. But neoliberalism actually is contestable at a much deeper level. So the one problem that neoliberalism cannot deal with is the monopoly corporation, is the idea that we live in an economy in which increasingly the sectors of that economy are dominated by small numbers of players. Almost every week in the financial press you can read the stories of new major worldwide mergers. I mean, just to look at the 70% of the UK supermarket market is dominated by 4 companies, right? The half of the world's car manufacturing is dominated, I think, now by 5 main players. In almost every industry, we see a monopolization of capital. There is no competition in those sectors that allows for the kind of economic efficiency that neoliberals talk about. But the biggest myth, and the thing that I think is really important for us, is the myth of the big state, the obsolescent state, and the myth of the neoliberal kind of arguments around the role of the state and the not just the bonfire of red tape, but the state more generally. And actually, there's a phrase used in the UK by a colleague of mine, Kevin Farnsworth, corporate welfare, where he uses that to argue that corporations are subsidized at every stage in the economy to a far higher degree than individuals are, than people who are in poverty or people who are out of work and so on. Corporate welfare by far outstretches the costs of social welfare. He argues that on an annual basis, at a very conservative estimate, 85 billion pounds a year goes to subsidies in the corporate sector, whether that's cheap credit, marketing support, public procurement, and so on. And I think this is really where we get to the kind of the crux of this argument about regulation, because actually the state intervenes at every point in the market, and particularly in the corporate economy. Think about the infrastructure. Think about the telecommunications, transport infrastructure that business never has to pay for. I'm going to tell a very quick story. I didn't mean to tell it, but I think this is kind of important in the context of, obviously I'm from the UK and people are thinking Brexit. Maybe some of you are thinking, what does he think about Brexit? I'll maybe ask him after. But I have to say, there's research in the UK which shows, and this doesn't explain Brexit, it doesn't explain the entirety of anti-European Union sentiment, but it does explain it in one small part of the country, in Derbyshire, in the UK. There's an area where there's a number of warehouses that have been set up, and they've been set up to support the Amazons and the Walmarts of this world. And so there are areas in that part of England where you can drive down roads where the signs are saying they've been provided by the European Union. And at the end of those roads is nothing except a huge warehouse where Amazon workers are working under terrible conditions and where people drive along those roads to work. And when you get there, you see that the industrial estate has a sign up saying that this is funded by European Union funding, right? Now, I don't want to oversimplify things, but I think it's a very good example of how the state subsidizes not just a corporate infrastructure, but a corporate infrastructure that we as trade unions would never support in a number of ways. And so that's actually one reason, in one small pocket of Britain, why there maybe was some support for Brexit. I think it's much more complex than that, and maybe we could talk about it later, because this speech could take a very long and boring detour, I think. But look, at every level of infrastructure, I'm an education worker. I mean, it's incredible to me, and I live in a nominally privatized system of higher education. My university is largely public funded, but increasingly the balance is towards fees that are paid for by students. The students, we don't know, but the latest government's estimates are maybe around 50% of those fees will ever be paid back. 50% will be shouldered by the public purse. The loan book has been privatized, so a financial conglomeration will make money from those loan repayments and the interest that accrue over the years. But and they benefit, they're big beneficiaries of the system. But even bigger beneficiaries of the system are the private companies that take in people who are highly trained, that I train. I teach social sciences, but most of my graduates go into the private sector now. So I hope they're highly trained. But certainly in other subjects, they would be highly trained. And who's paying for that? Well, a mixture of the student themselves and the taxpayer, right? So there's a huge kind of bonanza economy. Economists call this externalities. The externalities are those things that don't appear on the profit and loss account, but which companies benefit from and lose out from. Companies normally benefit from externalities. And this story, I mean, I'll give you a very clear example. I'm quite old, right? But when I left school, with the qualifications that I had, if I had left school at 16 in the UK, with the qualifications I had, I could have got a job as a bank clerk. To get that same job now, you need a degree, right? Now, if I'd left school when I was 16, the bank would have trained me to do that and would have invested in me and so on. They don't have to do that anymore. You replicate that over millions of young people coming through our education system. And I know the system's different here. I know you have a much more solid publicly funded system, but it's still subsidizing the private sector. It's one of those examples of infrastructural advantages that we don't count, that doesn't make the market look very efficient, and it doesn't look the state look very moribund in that sense. We could actually be here forever talking about this. You know, the number of government contracts which sustain particular industries. We wouldn't have a private medical industry in the UK. We wouldn't have a big globally leading pharmaceutical industry if it wasn't for government contracts. And actually, probably if it wasn't for the NHS. And that's certainly not a criticism of the NHS, but this is the symbiotic relationship that we can talk about. Export credit subsidies is huge in the UK. When we export anything from arms to there is a company very close to me actually still exports lead to be added to petrol in Algeria. That is subject to export credit subsidies if it's needed. Our diplomatic services now pretty much are there to support British businesses abroad. I think that's the case in many OECD countries now. Whenever the Prime Minister goes abroad on a trade trip, he always takes the leaders of the main corporations with him or her. I could go on and on and on. The state infrastructure is set up to support and subsidize capital at every turn, at every step on the way. We have a big discussion now about our railways. Our railways that were privatized 30 years ago are completely dependent on public subsidy, as every rail system should be. But we still have private operators, some of whom have failed recently and have had their franchises taken off them. We're now looking at the advent of public ownership, or bringing back into public ownership, renationalisation of some sections of the railways because they're so grossly inefficient. So, I think this is kind of a set of externalities, if you like, that we need to take into account. But I want to really focus this on the topic that I started with. If we think about deaths at work, the deaths of workers. Now, it varies depending on where you are. There are different levels of compensation that workers are legally entitled to for different things in different countries around the world. There are different abilities for workers to sue their employers and so on, right? But even in the most efficient system, the full costs of injuries and deaths caused to workers are never paid for because they're externalized. Think about the healthcare costs. No matter how much compensation is given to workers every year, it's only a fraction of the total healthcare costs of workers, or the loss of wages that you might hear a little bit more about from Paul. But the loss of wages over a lifetime is an external effect that businesses never have to pay when they kill workers. Exxon will never have to pay for the full damages of climate change, even though they knew that that's exactly, their scientists were telling them the effects of their industry in 1974. They'll never have to pay for the full impact on us because that cost will never be counted. I mean, in some respects, how can you count? In some respects, we're talking about externalities that can never be counted. How can you count the risk to the human species through climate change? How can you count the emotional impact of losing a loved one in a workplace disaster? Some of these costs cannot be counted, but the ones that can be counted, the ones that we have to pay to pick up the damage of, very rarely are. So this is really where we get to the crux of it, because the corporate world in this sense is set up in order to externalize, in order to not be responsible, in order to not be liable for the full effects of work or of doing business. That's the way that it's set up. So how can we talk about responsible business? How can we talk about self-regulation of business? Are we going to expect all of these costs to come back to us in a system of self-regulation? The logic doesn't make sense when we look at the economy in those very stark terms, in those very real terms. The logic of better regulation that I know some of you have come across, some of you may not, but it's the kind of buzzword in regulatory systems around Europe, better regulation. And it normally means, actually, either self-regulation or co-regulation. I mean, we don't have time to kind of get into it, and I'm going to refer to the UK example because it's the example I know. But we've had all kinds of technical solutions that have been offered. They've been offered in a period of declining regulatory resources. They've been offered in a period where we've seen the number of frontline health and safety inspectors reduce in the last 30 years. It depends how you count it, but by at least a third, and still declining. The period of austerity putting pressure on even more. We've seen the number of inspections of workplaces decline in 25 years by 2/3, a halving of prosecutions in that period. This is better regulation. And the justification actually for this, it's very important to recognize that there is a justification. It's not just a question of people saying, well, slash resources and that's better regulation. There's a very complex technical justification, endless reams of government inquiries and papers into how we reshape and refocus the regulatory system, largely based on risk technologies. I'm sure you're facing the same thing here in Norway, because it's also the kind of the way in which regulation is being reshaped at the level of the European Union. Targeted intervention is the key phrase here. That you can target your intervention by being smarter, as if to say, that for all these years, regulators haven't realized they're just not smart enough. You can be smarter. What does being smarter mean? I'll give you one example. In the UK, it meant the redefinition of work. The redefinition of high-risk work as low-risk work. We never had that very clear distinction. We had hazardous industries which would be given a lot more resources. So the chemical industries, nuclear and so on, right? Oil production. We had, and we had other workplaces. But now we have a very clear distinction between low-risk work and high-risk work. And in low-risk work, the policy now is they don't need to be inspected. Roughly, I can't remember the percentage, but it's the majority of workplaces are now deemed to be low-risk work. My workplace is low-risk work. My building is full of asbestos. That's low-risk work now, because I work in a university. They took whole industries out of the inspection regime, and this happened in the coalition government, began in the coalition government around 2012 in the UK. Hazards, the hazards movement, the trade union rank and file health and safety movement in the UK that I mentioned before, did some research, and they found that 53% of deaths in the period they studied were occurring in low-risk work. The government now defines dock work as low-risk work. Light manufacturing is low-risk work. They've taken huge parts of the economy out of a system of routine inspection. If somebody dies in those industries, of course they may be investigated, not always, but they may be investigated, but there is no routine inspection of these industries. This is smart regulation. It doesn't sound very smart to me, but it's basically a way of legitimizing, targeted intervention is a way of legitimizing the shifting of resources, the undermining of regulatory resources, and also the constant questioning of frontline inspectors. Now frontline inspectors have to fill out a form to show, they have to justify that their intervention has not impacted on economic efficiency. That's now in UK legislation. So what I'm saying is that we have to be careful about this kind of idea of better regulation. But in a deeper sense, if I go back to the more kind of theoretical framework I was articulating before, It also is based on the idea that we are too antagonistic, that there's too much of a kind of antagonism between the state and the market. And that's what we really need to unpick. Because as I said before, when I started off, our obvious kind of reaction is to say, well, we need more enforcement, we need more law, we need more prosecution, right? And in a context where prosecutions have more than halved, prosecutions of employers who kill their workers have more than halved, of course we need more prosecutions. But there's also a problem, I think, with limiting our argument to just prosecutions, and that it becomes apparent when we ask when we ask what happens when law is actually enforced. So, in some work done with my colleague Steve Toombs, who was the co-author of the book Corporate Criminal mentioned in the introduction, we looked at a plant, we looked at a chipboard, a wood particle board manufacturing plant in Merseyside, near where we both live and work. And the reason we did an analysis of this plant because it looked like a real archetypal corporate criminal. It was a chipboard plant, as I say, particle board plant run by a company called Sonai, owned and operated by Sonai, which is a Portuguese conglomerate. And it was based in a very poor area of Merseyside. And what happened within, the plant was established 20 years ago. Within a year of it being opened up, there was complaints in the local community about toxic dust, people having respiratory illnesses and so on. There was a number of investigations. After a while, there was a series of fires on the plant because they weren't keeping the byproducts in the right way. And then there were a series of worker injuries. So it became, it was as a kind of case study. We were academics. We were talking to people in the local community and we were talking to people in the trade unions. But we also thought, okay, this is a really important case study of corporate crime. The interesting thing about this plant was that within a 3-year period, it had 3 prosecutions for environmental violations and 4 prosecutions for health and safety violations, right? It had more than an average of 2 prosecutions a year in a very short period. Over the lifetime of the plant, it was open for about 10 years. It had 11 prosecutions. This is very, very rare, and for kind of corporate crime academics, we think, okay, this is what's happening. This is what should happen, that where there are violations, they should be investigated and prosecuted. What we didn't realize is that a minority of the violations were being prosecuted when we looked at it. And the plant only closed. Towards the end of the plant, 3 workers died in 2 separate incidents. A guy called James Key was crushed to death in an incident in August 2011. But a year previously, in 2010, December 2010, 2 workers, Thomas Elber and James Bibby, had been dragged into a silo with a conveyor belt and killed. So there had been 2 separate fatalities in the same factory, and eventually it was closed. It wasn't closed because of its criminal record or because it killed workers. It was closed, and it wasn't closed because the local MP called for its closure in Parliament, which happened. It closed, ultimately, because the company wasn't making enough money. Its revenue had dipped. And we looked at the accounts. That was clearly why they closed. There was a regulatory tolerance of that plant because it was in a relatively poor area and people needed the jobs. None of the trade union members, representatives there were calling for the plant to be closed down. Some members of the community were calling for the plant to be closed down, but it was mixed, right? Because of course this is a very poor area that needs jobs. So there's a certain regulatory tolerance. This is an extreme example, right? But there's always a certain regulatory tolerance when there is a contribution to the economy, right? And that's a really, I think, important limitation on the enforcement of the law in that sense. Look, that company, the biggest fine was £40,000. But even when you have the largest fines apportioned, And this is something that happens as a trick through the structure of the corporation. I realise that I'm up to my 40 minutes, but maybe if I could have 2 more minutes to close off. When a corporation is fined, even if that company had been fined 4 million, the company would still be able to decide how to allocate the cost of that fine. And those costs might be allocated in terms of increasing the price of its products or in cutting the wages of its workers. It doesn't matter. In fact, if you look at a number of years ago, the record fine was against a company called Transco. The record fine in the UK for a health and safety violation was against a company called Transco that killed a family of 4 through a gas explosion. It was fined 14 million, but then the company was able to decide how those costs were distributed. Now, I looked at the evidence we had, and the company cut its maintenance budgets in successive years after that fine. Now, the whole problem that had led to the explosion was because of a cut in maintenance teams, maintenance workers. And that's what the company continued to do. That's how it retrieved the cost of its fine. So, in that sense, the fine reproduced the very problem that the fine was supposed to deal with, right? So obviously, more law, more prosecution, in isolation from everything else, is not the solution. Obviously, we need to look at solutions which are legal. I mean, don't get me wrong, we all know how symbolic it is when a company does not get prosecuted when it does something like that. That's the point, right? The message that it sends out undermines us as workers, and it undermines our power to organize, right? If there isn't a threat of legal enforcement. But at the same time, we need to recognize that law is not necessarily the answer. More regulation is not necessarily the only answer. More antagonism. I've set out why I think the relationship between the state and the market, or the state and capital, is not particularly antagonistic. Then surely we have to think about ways in which we do rein in capital and make things more antagonistic. But ultimately, I think we have to always link our demands for more law to demands in changing the structure of industry and changing the structure of the corporation. We need to demand real power over the economic supply chain where things can be externalized, not just in the way that I've outlined, but any subcontracting relationship is a form of externalizing costs. We need to make sure that we tackle those increasingly complex supply chains which dominate all parts of the economy. But we need to think about whether we can sustain an economy in which the corporation, the private corporation, is able to exist in its present form, is able to exist in a way where it's virtually impermeable to law. And I think that's the big question that we don't ask very often. I don't ask it as a trade unionist in the UK. We don't ask it enough in the trade union movement. But how do we fundamentally change the conditions of our work? How do we fundamentally change our chances of surviving or dying at work? How do we fundamentally change the state of the environment? How do we fundamentally change an overheating planet if we don't change the structure of the economy? And I think that means changing the structure of the corporation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you.